Until the extraordinary affair at Sidmouth, the peculiar species Haploteuthis ferox was known to science only generically, on the strength of a half-digested tentacle obtained near the Azores and a decaying body pecked by birds and nibbled by fish, found by one Mr. Jennings near Land's End early in 1896. In no department of zoological science, indeed, are we quite so much in the dark as we are with regard to the deep-sea cephalopods. A mere accident, for instance, it was that led to the Prince of Monaco's discovery of nearly a dozen new forms in the summer of 1895, a discovery in which the aforementioned tentacle was included. It chanced that a cachalot was killed off Terceira by some whalers, and in its last struggles it charged almost to the prince's yacht, missed it, rolled under, and died within 20 yards of his rudder. In its final agony, it threw up a number of large objects, which the prince, dimly perceiving their strangeness, was by a happy expedient able to secure before they sank, and these objects proved to be whole specimens and fragments of cephalopods, some of gigantic proportions, almost all of them unknown to science. I mean, it would seem indeed that these large and agile creatures living in the middle depths of the sea must to a large extent forever remain unknown to us, since underwater they're simply too nimble for our nets, and it is only by such rare unlooked-for accidents that specimens can be obtained. In the case of Haploteuthis ferox, for instance, we're still altogether ignorant as to its habitat, and ignorant as we are of the breeding ground of the herring or the seaways of the salmon, and zoologists are altogether at a loss to account for its sudden appearance on our coast. I mean, possibly it was the stress of a hunger migration that drove it hither out of the deep, but it will perhaps better be to avoid unnecessarily inconclusive discussion and to proceed instead with my narrative. The first human being to set eyes upon a living Haploteuthis, the first human being to survive, that is, for there can be little doubt now that the wave of bathing fatalities and boating accidents that travelled along the coast of Cornwall and Devon in early May was due to this cause. But the first living human being to survive was a retired tea dealer by the name of Fison, who was staying at a Sidmouth boarding house. It was in the afternoon, and he was walking along the cliff path between Sidmouth and Ladram Bay. Now, the cliffs in this direction are very high, but down the red face of them in one place is a kind of a ladder staircase. Now, Fison was near this when his attention was attracted by what at first he thought was a cluster of birds struggling over a fragment of food. It caught the sunlight and it glistened pinkish white. Now, the tide was right out, and this object was not only far below him, but remote across a broad waste of rock reefs covered with dark seaweed and interspersed with silvery tidal pools. I mean, he was, moreover, dazzled by the brightness of the further water. But in a minute he perceived that his initial judgment was in fault. For over this struggle there circled a number of birds, jackdaws and gulls for the most part, and they seemed minute in comparison with the object. Well, Mr. Fison's curiosity was aroused all the more strongly, perhaps, because of his first insufficient explanations, and as he had nothing better to do, he decided to make this object, whatever it was, the goal of his afternoon walk instead of Ladram Bay. He conceived that it might perhaps be a great fish of some sort, stranded and flapping about in its distress. So he hurried down the long, steep ladder, stopping at intervals of 30 feet or so to take a breath and to scan this mysterious movement. At the foot of the cliff he was, of course, nearer his object than he had been before, but it now came up against the incandescent sky, and so it seemed dark and indistinct. I mean, whatever was pinkish of it was now hidden by a skerry of weedy boulders, but he could tell that it was made up of 7 rounded bodies, and that the birds kept up a constant croaking and screaming, and seemed afraid to approach it too closely. Well, Fison, torn by curiosity, began picking his way across the rocks, and finding that the seaweed rendered them extremely slippery, he stopped, removed his shoes and socks, and rolled his trousers above his knees. Now, his object was, of course, to avoid stumbling into the rocky pools about him, although perhaps he was also rather glad, as I think all men are, of an excuse to resume for a moment the sensations of his boyhood. At any rate, it is to this approached his mark with all the assurance which the absolute security of this country against all forms of animal life gives its inhabitants. The round bodies moved to and fro, but it was only when he surmounted the skerry of boulders that he realised the horrible nature of his discovery. It came upon him with some suddenness. The rounded bodies fell apart as he came into sight over the ridge, and the pinkish object was revealed to be the partially devoured body of a human being. Whether of a man or a woman he was unable to say. The rounded bodies were ghastly-looking creatures, in shape somewhat resembling an octopus, with huge and very long and flexible tentacles coiled copiously on the ground. Their skin had an unpleasant glistening texture like shiny leather, and the downward bend of the tentacle-surrounded mouth, the curious excrescence at the bend, the tentacles themselves, and the large intelligent eyes gave the creatures a grotesque suggestion of a face. They were the size of a huge swine around the body, and the tentacles seemed to be many, many feet in length. There were, Fison thinks, 7 or 8 of these creatures, and 20 yards beyond them, amid the surf of the returning tide, 2 others were now emerging from the sea. Their bodies lay flatly on the rocks, and their eyes regarded Mr. Fison with evil interest. But it does not appear then that he was afraid at all, or that he realised that he was in any danger. He was, however, of course, horrified and intensely excited and indignant at such revolting creatures preying upon human flesh. He presumed that they had chanced upon a drowned body, so he shouted at them to drive them off, and finding that they did not budge, he cast about him, picked up a large rounded lump of rock and flung it at one. And then slowly, uncoiling their tentacles, they began moving towards him, creeping and making a soft purring sound to each other as they moved. Well, in a moment Mr. Fison realised the danger. He shouted again, threw both his boots, and started off with a leap. 20 yards off he stopped and faced about, assuming that the creatures would be slow, and behold, the tentacles of their leader were already pouring over the rocky ridge on which he'd just been standing. He shouted again, this time a cry of dismay, and he began jumping, slipping, wading across the uneven expanse between him and the beach. The tall red cliff suddenly seemed at a vast distance, and he saw, as if they were creatures of another world, 2 workmen far off, engaged in the repair of the ladderway, and little suspecting the race for life that was beginning below them. At one time he could hear the creature splashing in the pools not a dozen feet behind him, and once he slipped and almost fell. They chased him to the very bottom of the cliffs, and desisted only when he'd been joined by the workmen at the foot of the ladder up the cliff. The 3 men pelted them with stones for a time, and then they hurried to the cliff top and along the path towards Sidmouth to secure assistance in a boat and to rescue the desecrated body from the clutches of these abominable creatures. Well, as if he had not already been in sufficient peril that day, Mr. Fison went with the boat to point out the exact spot of his adventure. As the tide was now down, it required a considerable detour to reach the spot, and when at last they came off the ladderway, the mangled body had disappeared. The water was running in now, submerging first one slab of slimy rock and then another, and the 4 men in the boat, that is the 2 workmen, the boatman and Mr. Fison, now turned their attention to the water beneath the keel. Now, at first they could see little below them but a large jungle of laminaria with an occasional darting fish. Their minds were set on adventure, however, and they expressed their disappointment freely. But presently they saw one of these monsters swimming through the water towards the sea with a curious rolling motion that suggested to Mr. Fison the spinning roll of a captive balloon, he said. And almost immediately afterwards, the waving streamers of laminaria were perturbed as they parted for a moment, and three of the beasts became darkly visible, struggling for what was probably some fragment of the drowned man. Now, in a moment, the copious olive-green ribbons had poured again over this writhing group, and now all four men, greatly excited, began beating the water with oars and shouting, and immediately there was the most tremendous movement, a tumult among the weeds. They desisted to see more clearly, and as soon as the water was smooth, they saw, as it seemed to them, the whole sea bottom among the weeds set with eyes. There were dozens of them, and forthwith the things began to rise through the water about them. Now, Mr. Fison has since described to me this startling eruption out of the waving laminaria meadows. I mean, to him, he said, it seemed to occupy a considerable space of time, but I think it was probable that really it was only a matter of a few seconds. For a time, there were only eyes. And then Mr. Fison speaks of tentacles streaming out and parting the weed fronds this way and that, and then those bodies growing larger until at last the bottom of the sea was hidden by their intercoiling forms, and the tips of tentacles rose here and there into the air above the swell of the waters. One monster came up to the side of the boat, and clinging to it with three of his tentacles, he threw four others over the gunwale as if intending to clamber on board. Mr. Fison at once caught up the boat hook and, jabbing furiously at the soft tentacles, forced it off. He was almost struck in the back and pitched overboard by the boatman, who was using his oar to resist a similar attack on the other side of the boat. But the tentacles on either side relaxed their hold, slid out of sight, and splashed into the water. "We'd better get out of this," said Mr. Fison, who was now trembling rather violently. He went to the tiller while the boatman and one of the workmen seated themselves and began rowing. Now the other workman stood up in the forepart of the boat with the boat hook ready to strike any more tentacles that might appear. Nothing else seems to have been said between them, and a hushed, scared mood descended upon them. Their faces were white and drawn as they set about escaping. The oars had scarcely dropped into the water, however, before dark, tapering serpentine ropes had bound around them and about the rudder, and creeping up the sides of the boat with a looping motion came those suckers again. The men gripped their oars and pulled, but it was like trying to move a boat in a floating raft of weeds. "Help here!" cried the bowman, and Mr. Fison and the second workman rushed to help lug at the oar. And then the man with the boat hook, his name was Ewan, sprang up with a curse and began striking downward over the side as far as he could reach at this bank of tentacles that now clustered along the boat's bottom. And at the same time, the two rowers stood up to get a better purchase for the recovery of the oars. The boatman handed his oar to Mr. Fison, and then he opened a big clasp knife, and leaning over the side of the boat, he began hacking at the arms upon the oar shaft. Mr. Fison, staggering with the rocking of the boat, the veins standing out on his arms and forehead as he pulled at his oar, suddenly cast his eye seaward, and there, not 50 yards off, across the long rollers of the incoming tide, was a large boat standing in towards them with 3 women and a little child on board. A boatman was rowing it, and a little man in a pink ribbon straw hat and whites stood in the stern hailing them. And for a moment, of course, Mr. Fison thought only of help, and then he thought of the child. He abandoned his oar, threw up his arms, and screamed to the party in the boat, "For God's sake, keep away!" Now, it says much for his modesty and courage, I think, that Mr. Fison does not seem to be aware that there's any quality of heroism in his action at this juncture. The oar that he'd abandoned was at once dragged under water and presently reappeared floating about 20 yards away. And at the same moment, he felt the boat under him lurch violently, and a hoarse scream of terror from Hill, the boatman, caused him to forget the party of excursionists altogether. He turned and he saw Hill crouching by the forward rowlock, his face convulsed and his right arm over the side of the boat. Now, Mr. Fison believes that he must have been hacking at the tentacles below the waterline and have been grasped by them, but of course it's quite impossible now to say for certain what had really happened. The boat was heeling over, however, and the gunwale was now within 10 inches of the water, and both Ewan and the other labourer were striking down with oar and boat hook on either side of Hill's arm. Mr. Fison instinctively placed himself to counterpoise them, and then Hill, who was a burly, powerful, strong fellow, made the most Herculean effort and rose almost to a standing position. He managed to lift his arm clear of the water, and hanging on it was a tangle of brown ropes, and the eyes of one of the brutes that had hold of him showed momentarily above the surface of the water. The boat heeled once more, and the green-brown ocean came cascading over the side. And then Hill slipped and fell with his ribs across the side, and his arm and the mass of tentacles about it splashed back into the water. He rolled over, and after a brief convulsive struggle was lugged overboard as fresh tentacles whipped about his waist and neck. The boat righted itself with a violent jerk that all but sent Mr. Fison over the other side and hid the struggle in the water from his eyes. He stood staggering to recover his balance for a moment, and as he did so he became aware that the struggle and the inflowing tide had carried them close upon the weedy rocks again. Not 4 yards off, a table of rock rose in rhythmic movements above the inwash of the tide. In a moment, Mr. Fison seized the oar from Ewan, gave it one vigorous stroke, and then dropping it, ran to the bows and leapt. He felt his feet slide over the rock, and by a frantic effort he leapt again towards a further mass. He stumbled over this, came to his knees and rose again, and then he was knocked flat into a tidal pool by one of the workmen behind him. And as he went down, he heard smothered, choking cries that he believed at the time came from Hill, and then he found himself marvelling at the shrillness and variety of Hill's voice. And he scrambled to his feet again, and without looking seaward, ran as fast as his terror would let him towards the shore. Before him, over the flat space of scattered rocks, stumbled the 2 workmen. He looked over his shoulder at last, and seeing that he was not pursued, he faced about and was astonished. From the moment of the rising of the cephalopods out of the water, he had been acting too swiftly to fully comprehend his actions. But now it seemed to him as if he had leapt out of an evil dream. For there was the sky, cloudless and blazing with the afternoon sun, the sea weltering under its pitiless brightness, the soft creamy foam of the breaking water, the long, low, dark ridges of rock. The righted boat floated now, rising and falling gently on the swell, about a dozen yards from the shore. Hill and the monsters, all the stress and tumult of that fierce fight for life, had vanished as though they'd never been. Now Mr. Fison's heart was still beating violently. He was throbbing to his fingertips, and his breath came deep as he realised that there was something missing. For some seconds he couldn't think clearly enough what it might be. The sun, sky, sea, rocks, what was missing? And then he remembered the boatload of excursionists. It had vanished, and he wondered whether he'd imagined it. He turned and saw the 2 workmen standing side by side under the projecting masses of the tall pink cliffs. He hesitated whether he should make one last attempt to save Mr. Hill, but no, his physical excitement seemed to desert him suddenly. He turned shoreward, stumbling and wading towards his 2 companions. He looked back once more, and now there were 2 boats floating out there. The one furthest out at sea, pitched clumsily, bottom upwards. And so it was that Haploteuthis ferox made its appearance on the Devonshire coast. Now, so far, this has been its most serious aggression. Mr. Fison's account, taken together with the wave of boating and bathing casualties to which I've already alluded, and the absence of fish on the Cornish coast that year, point clearly to a shoal of these monsters prowling slowly along the subtitled coastline. Hunger migration, as I said, has been suggested as the force that drove them hither, but for my part I prefer to believe the theory of Helmsley. Helmsley holds that a shoal of these creatures may have become enamoured of human flesh by the accident of a foundered ship sinking among them, and have wandered in search of it out of their accustomed zone, waylaying and following ships, and so coming to our shores in the wake of the Atlantic traffic. But, to discuss Mr. Hemley's perfectly cogent and admirably stated arguments would be out of place here. It would seem that the daily appetite of the shoal was satisfied by the catch of 11 people, for so far as can be ascertained, there were 10 people on board the second boat, and certainly these creatures gave no further signs of their presence off Sidmouth that day. The coast between Seaton and Budleigh Salterton was patrolled all that evening and night by 4 preventative service boats, the men in which are armed with harpoons and cutlasses, and as the evening advanced, a number of more or less similarly equipped expeditions organised by private individuals joined them. Mr. Fison himself took no further part. About midnight, excited hails were heard from a boat a couple of miles out at sea to the southeast of Sidmouth, and a lantern was seen waving in a strange manner. The nearer boats at once hurried towards the alarm. Now, the venturesome occupants of that boat, it was a seaman, a curate, and 2 schoolboys, had actually seen the monsters passing beneath them. That they were, it seems, like most deep-sea organisms, phosphorescent, and had been floating some 5 fathoms deep or so, like creatures of moonshine through the blackness of the water, their tentacles retracted as if asleep, rolling over and moving slowly in a wedge-like formation towards the southeast. Now that these people told their story in gesticulated fragments, as first one boat drew along and then another. And at last there was a little fleet of 8 or 9 boats collected together, and from them a tumult, like the chatter of a marketplace, rose into the stillness of the night. Now there was little or no disposition to pursue the shoal. The people had neither weapons nor experience for such a dubious chase, and presently, with, I suspect, a certain relief, the boats turned shoreward. And now to tell you what is perhaps the most astonishing fact in this whole astonishing raid. That we have not the slightest knowledge of the subsequent movements of the shoal, although the whole southwest coast was now alert for it. 2 weeks and 3 days after the Sidmouth affair, a living Haploteuthis came ashore on Calais sands. It was alive because several witnesses saw its tentacles moving in a convulsive way, but it was probable that it was dying. A gentleman called Monsieur Pouchet shot it with a rifle. And that was the last appearance of a living Haploteuthis. On the 15th of June, a dead carcass was washed ashore near Torquay, and a few days later, a boat from the Marine Biological Station, engaged in dredging off Plymouth, picked up a rotting specimen, slashed deeply with a cutlass wound. How the former had come by its death, it's impossible to say. And then, on the last day of June, Mr. Egbert Kane, an artist bathing near Newlyn, threw up his arms, shrieked, and disappeared under the water. A friend bathing with him made no attempt to save him, but swam at once for the shore. And this is the final act to tell in this extraordinary raid from the deeper sea. I mean, whether we really have seen the last of these horrible creatures, it is, of course, premature to say. But it is believed, and it is certainly to be hoped, that they have now returned for good to the sunless depth of the Middle Seas, out of which they so strangely and so mysteriously arose. Thank you for your time.